We've had two-tier Keir, two-tier police, now we've got two-tier sentencing. We'll be joined by Shadow Justice Secretary Robert Jenrick to discuss why equality laws seem to be discriminating against white people.
There are certain groups who are more likely to be in prison than others. That's not disputed. But it's much more complex than saying that all ethnic minorities are overrepresented in the prison estate.
So, Kamal, where are we at with two-tier justice? Because we had a situation where the Sentencing Council came out with these guidelines basically saying that people from ethnic minorities should be treated favourably because they are overrepresented in the crime statistics and therefore need to be cut a little more slack than white people. But clearly white people are saying, hang on a minute, you're trying to solve an equality problem with more discrimination against us.
I don't think they quite said favourably.
No, right.
I think what they said is that, for example, there is some data that says that black people in the justice system are more likely to be given an immediate custodial sentence in comparison with white people. Of course, we think that women's experience, if they are pregnant or have very strong caring responsibilities for children, you might want to consider that before you sentence. But the signal that has been taken and the problem they have is that they are lumping big groups of people together and saying you need to treat them differently. And the Conservatives in particular, but many, many others have said this has led to two-tier sentencing.
I think we can all understand that sentencing does have mitigating factors when decisions are made by judges. But should your own characteristics and culture automatically be a mitigating factor? That's the question, isn't it, Kamal?
What I find very interesting about this is that Labour know it's a problem as well. Maybe you would have thought in a situation like this, you'd have the Conservatives being strong and saying this has all gone too far, the considerations on issues of so-called equality. You might imagine Labour would dig in and say, no, the Conservatives are, playing the wrong tune and we've got different values. But actually, Shabana Mahmood, the Justice Secretary, is equally angry about what the Sentencing Council is doing and has said that the new guidance that they have put in place, she wants to overturn. There is part of this which... Does it worry me? I don't know if it worries me, but there's a concern is how much should politicians be able to overrule the legal system that has decided that this advice to judges about pre-sentencing reports should be modelled in this way? Should politicians then become involved and say, we don't really like that, you should change it? I just wondered, Camilla, given your legal education, do you worry about politicians overturning what the justice system is doing?
Not necessarily, because I actually think, and we're not in the situation that America is in where judicial appointments are political ones, but I think the judiciary has become politicised. And that doesn't mean it's necessarily ideological. I think it's very difficult. For instance, our colleague Dominic Penner has pointed out that one member of the Sentencing Council seems to be vehemently opposed to immigration controls. And if that's the case, should she really be presiding over cases involving asylum seekers? Because she'll want them to be given preferential treatment because that is what she believes, arguably. So I've always had a problem, actually, with... I appreciate that we've got to put the judiciary on a pedestal because these are the people who are enforcing the laws of the land. But I don't think that means that they're beyond reproach, criticism, or indeed scrutiny.
It's now expected that Mahmood will introduce emergency legislation to close the loophole around not being able to overturn the Sentencing Council's guidelines. And here she is speaking at the time the row first broke.
I think the whole House can see that the only pretence at a job is the one that the Shadow Lord Chancellor is doing because he's pretending to be the leader of the opposition. We all know exactly what he is about. And my reaction to what has happened in relation to the Sentencing Council's guidelines was very clear when we did the oral statement last week in this House. We will never stand for a two-tier approach to sentencing, but I am actually getting on with fixing the problem rather than looking for a bandwagon to jump on. That is why I have already written to the Sentencing Council. I will be meeting with them later in this week, and I have made it very clear I will consider their role and their powers, and if I need to legislate legislate, I will do so, but I will make sure that whatever changes I bring forward are workable and they deliver the fair justice system that we all need and deserve, and one his government did not deliver.
Joining us now is a man who has claimed that Labour are trying to hoodwink the public on this two-tiered justice row, Shadow Justice Secretary Robert Jenrick. Thank you for joining us on the Daily Tea.
Hello.
Let's get started on the latest Telegraph story that people from ethnic minorities and women should be prioritised for bail. What's your reaction to that?
Well, look, the Labour Party, Keir Starmer and Shabana Mahmood, the Justice Secretary, said that they were dead against two-tier justice when a few weeks ago I revealed that the Sentencing Council were proposing these biased guidelines that come into force tomorrow. But here we have more evidence of it, and this time not from the Sentencing Council, but from the Justice Secretary's own department. And there's two aspects to this latest revelation. One, that when you're considering somebody for bail, you should prioritise certain groups such as ethnic minorities. And then secondly, the probation service is being asked to take into account when considering somebody's sentencing, their culture, whether or not they might have been subject to so-called intergenerational trauma, whether the historical events that their community or group has been affected by. This is complete madness. This is two-tier justice. What we want to see is equality before the law, where everyone is treated the same, regardless of the colour of their skin or the faith that they abide by. And that is why it is so important now that we sort this out. I think we need to have a root and branch trawl through all of the guidance, the rules, the policy documents that the Ministry of Justice has put out, and get rid of all of this two-tier nonsense and restore sanity and equality before the law to the system.
What's happening today? Because it looks like the Labour government are pretty much in agreement with you. Shabana Mahmood is trying to push through emergency legislation through the Commons to override the Sentencing Council's guidelines. What's going to happen later today?
Well, the Justice Secretary, we are told through the media, is going to bring forward some legislation to correct what the Sentencing Council has proposed. But this is too little, too late. I warned her about this weeks ago. She didn't do anything about it. I brought a bill to Parliament which would have given her the power to reject or amend sentencing guidelines. She rebuffed that. I told her to sack the members of the Sentencing Council who'd brought forward these biased guidelines. She hasn't done that. So she's now waited to the point where there are literally just hours to go before these guidelines come into force. If she brings forward legislation this week, it's not going to be law for days, perhaps weeks, during which time there will be two-tier justice in this country by her own admission, and there will be people being sentenced according to these guidelines. This is all foreseeable. It could have been resolved a long time ago, but she's sat on her hands, she's done nothing, and I'm afraid she has failed the country very badly.
Can I ask how we trace this back in history? How did it come to pass that ethnic minorities were going to be treated in a different way to white people in the criminal justice system? Because if we look back to David Cameron's administration, it was back in 2016 when the Tories commissioned a review into the over-representation of ethnic minorities in the criminal justice system. So is this harking back to that? I know you're opposing it as a Conservative, but did all this start with the Conservatives?
Well, the Telegraph story today, the Ministry of Justice, rather misleadingly, well, in fact, it was completely wrong. They claimed that this was something that had begun under the last Conservative government. That's not correct. The proposal to prioritise the requirement to prioritise ethnic minority groups for bail was started by the last Labour government, and the even more worrying proposal to the probation service to take into account culture when considering pre-sentencing reports, that is entirely new. And that is something that Shabana Mahmood's department has signed off and published in January of this year. But there is a broader issue behind this, which you're right to raise, about how race and the criminal justice system interact. I don't believe that our criminal justice system is institutionally racist. There's no consistent or conclusive evidence of that. There are certain groups who are more likely to be in prison than others. That's not disputed. But it's much more complex than saying that all ethnic minorities are overrepresented in the prison estate. In fact, there are some communities, if you look at, say, British Hindus or British Sikhs, who are less likely to be in prison, who are less likely to commit crimes than broader society. So if you lump everybody in together in this incredibly crude way, you may actually find that you create new unfairnesses, greater discrimination. And the consequences of this approach are potentially very serious in terms of public safety. If you take, for example, transgender people, the majority of transgender prisoners are in prison for sexual offences. And so if you follow the logic of the proponents of these policies and had fewer of those prisoners in jail, then you'd have people who have been convicted of very serious sexual crimes out on the streets, posing harm to the public when they should be in prison. I don't think this is the right approach. If there is racism and discrimination in society, then that should be tackled. But you shouldn't be trying to use the criminal justice system for social engineering, because that just creates more discrimination and bad outcomes for the public.
So is it a question of nuance rather than should you be trying to correct, for example, black people are more likely to get a custodial sentence than white people? There is data and evidence for that. Do you think that that is a matter that should be considered by pre-sentencing reports or not?
I don't think that's the place to consider this. I think that that is an important question that needs to be carefully considered. And the Sentencing Council have done so themselves, and they have said that they don't fully understand why that is. Most of the evidence and the studies have concluded that there is no direct link between somebody's ethnicity and the decision to charge or the sentence that somebody ultimately receives. There are, as you say, certain groups who are more likely to be in prison than others. There are certain groups who are more likely to commit crimes than others. And it works, of course, in the opposite direction, as I said, where there are some ethnic minority communities who are far less likely than broader society to commit crime. But I think the right place to be tackling racism or discrimination is earlier on. It's in broader society. It's not trying to socially engineer our criminal justice system, whether it's through pre-sentencing reports or otherwise, to fix these problems. What we don't want to see is an attempt to have equity of outcome, because that can never be achieved. And if one tries to do it, you're actually going to have potentially more discrimination, where people, like, say, a British Hindu or a British Sikh, are we going to say that more of those people should be going to jail merely to achieve some sort of false parity? That's not the right approach.
I just wondered what your thoughts were then on women. Often have very different caring responsibilities, might have children. Obviously, being pregnant may affect the way that sentencing might be passed on them if they've been involved in the criminal justice system. Do you think the same for the treatment of female prisoners, that you shouldn't take into account any facts that may pertain to their life pre their sentencing? I mean, this idea of blind justice, I think, is where you're sort of wanting to get to, which I completely understand. But I just wondered, when it comes down to the facts of the case, women do have different experiences from men in the justice system. Surely that should be taken into account. That's all the Sentencing Council is saying here.
Well, I've always said that there is a role for pre-sentencing reports. And I think you raise a very good example, which is pregnant women, where it's right that the court carefully considers whether or not to send a pregnant woman to prison. And in most cases, we avoid that in the system today, and that's for perfectly sensible reasons, because we don't want to subject a woman who's pregnant and an unborn child to that situation. And so the judge should think through the consequences of a custodial sentence. But that's very different to saying that a judge is required to conduct a pre-sentencing report for all ethnic minorities, or all women, or all people who are from so-called minority faiths, such as anyone who isn't a Christian. Those are creating giant blanket cohorts of people. And that, I think, is corrosive to trust and confidence in the justice system, because it's so crude and it seems to be biased against everyone else in society, and in particular, white people, men and Christians.
Isn't the problem with, this is about two-tier justice again, isn't the problem that we need to fundamentally reform our equality law? Because what seems to be happening here with the Sentencing Council, they say that there is a duty, for example, equality assessments, for example, which are linked back to our equality law apparatus that's been set up since 2000 and the last Labour government, but not particularly reformed by the Conservative government after that. Is your point that needs to be completely reformed? Because it's the Equality Act that gives these incredibly broad brush characteristics, they're called protected characteristics, which are things like ethnic minorities, which, as you suggest, is almost meaningless in a country like the United Kingdom. Now, isn't it time for the Equality Act to be dumped and reformed?
Well, I've said before that the Equalities Act needs to be reviewed because I think it has had a number of perverse consequences. And I've read reports where campaign groups have said that anyone who has a so-called protected characteristic should be treated differently through our criminal justice system, should be provided with a pre-sentencing report. And that's a very crude way to categorise people, isn't it? Saying just because you are of a particular faith or because you are a member of the Gypsy Roma traveller community, you should be treated differently through the criminal justice system. I think most people who fall into those categories would take objection to that. You know, it's cultural relativism, isn't it, to think that you are more likely to commit crime or you should be treated more leniently because of an inherent characteristic about you. So I think this whole area now requires very careful thought. The legislative framework and the way in which it has been applied or misapplied in recent years. And I would like to see the government go through all of the rules, the guidelines that have been produced, not just by the Sentencing Council, but the Ministry of Justice and in policing as well, like by the National Police Chiefs Council, and root out all of this stuff, which I think is immensely corrosive to trust in policing, in the criminal justice system more broadly.
I'm just looking at it now because I'm just thinking around the table. It doesn't seem right, a man of colour, a woman, a white man, if we were all accused of the same thing, let's call it theft from the shop down the road, it does seem unbelievable that we wouldn't all be treated equally.
But you might, I suppose the point is what the system is trying to do. It's not so much that the groups may be more likely to commit crime. It's that the justice system won't treat them fairly. So as a woman, Camilla, you may go through the system and have a different experience from Robert Jenrick as a white man, because you may have, like, you know, as you said, Robert, when you talked about, you know, if you were pregnant, for example. So I think there is a degree of sensitivity and nuance, which I'm hearing from you. You know, I'm hearing that there are issues around the way
to address
the system treats you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think there are two issues. Are some groups in society more likely to commit crime and find themselves in jail? Yes. Is there any conclusive evidence that the system itself discriminates against people so that you are more likely to be charged or to be given a longer sentence just because of your gender, your faith, the colour of your skin? No, there isn't any conclusive, consistent evidence of that. And the Sentencing Council and the Ministry of Justice in their own documents say that. And so we've got to separate out those two things. We all want to see a society which is free from racism and discrimination, and real effort put in by government and others to stop that. But we don't want to create more discrimination by using the criminal justice system to create equity of outcome where it's not necessary. We want equality before the law.
Can we move on to today's Immigration Summit? We've heard from Keir Starmer championing Labour's achievements on immigration since coming into government. Let's have a listen to that.
We're also deploying resources away from the Tories' wasteful Rwanda scheme, a scheme that spent over £700 million of taxpayer money to remove just 4 volunteers. Now, you know, even if that scheme had gone well, they were claiming that they might remove 300 people a year. Well, since coming to office, I can announce today we've returned more than 24,000 people who have no right to be here. That would have taken the Rwanda scheme 80 years to achieve.
Well, look, I think that Keir Starmer has failed on almost every measure since coming into office. If you look at the numbers of people who've come across on small boats, it's risen by 31% since he took office. In the last week alone, 4,000 people have broken into our country on small boats. The situation was bad prior to the Labour government. It's got significantly worse. It's almost like open season now, where illegal migrants and people smuggling gangs think they can get away with it. The answer to this problem is not trying to arrest your way out of it. It's having a proper deterrent. And you need to implement a system whereby if you come here illegally, you get detained, you get removed back home to your own country or to somewhere else within hours or days, not weeks or months. Labour scrapped the Rwanda deterrent, which was an attempt to do that, and haven't put in its place anything at all. And that's meant that the doors are wide open to our country right now.
But isn't the truth of the matter that nobody can really smash the gangs or stop the boats? Even Rishi Sunak, the architect in the end of the Rwanda plan, said that it was too binary to use that phrase, stop the boats. The boats aren't going to be stopped unless you literally put a wall up along the whole of the channel.
Well, I disagree with Rishi on that. Firstly, I don't think that the problem was the slogan or the comms strategy. The problem was that the government wasn't prepared to take the steps that were necessary to do the job. That's ultimately why I chose to resign as immigration minister. I do think there is an answer to this. It requires us to take very bold action. It requires us to fundamentally change our human rights laws so that we can detain people, we can end the merry-go-round of legal claims that are associated with asylum, and we can get those people out of our country. But it does ultimately come down to, are our leaders willing to take the tough action that's necessary? And Keir Starmer certainly isn't willing to do that. That's why he's dealing with these things which, are important, like having good relations with our neighbours and diplomatic cooperation and increasing policing at home and abroad, but are not the ultimate solutions.
Could we ask you a bit about what's being described as overzealous policing? Quite a few stories in the Telegraph over the past few days. We had a story which talked about the parents of a 9-year-old girl being arrested by police in Hertfordshire after they complained about their daughter's primary school in a WhatsApp group. I'm sure you've read about that, you're nodding. We've also had the Met Police this weekend raiding a Quaker meeting house to arrest 6 women attending a protest meeting on suspicion of conspiracy to cause a public nuisance. Are the police taking too aggressive a position on these types of incidents?
Well, I worry that the police are losing their way. The public want the police to be focused on enforcing the law and dealing with the crimes that are affecting all of us in our everyday lives, whether that's the most serious crimes or it's so-called minor crimes, but which actually have a profound impact, like burglary and theft, having a mobile phone nicked. Instead, we see some police officers and forces wasting resources, precious, finite resources, knocking on the door of a couple who were putting comments on a WhatsApp group about their kid's school, or knocking on the door of a Telegraph journalist because of something that she'd tweeted some time ago. Can we please have a return to common sense policing where the police focus on what really matters and not waste time on this complete nonsense? And for those of us who are, in Parliament, there are lessons as well. Let's abolish so-called non-crime hate incidents. Let's legislate to get rid of this whole thing, because the police do not have the resources to be dealing with this at the same time of all the things that the public really expect them to be doing.
One last question. It might be a bit of a curveball because I know you've been dealing with all of your justice brief today, but Marine Le Pen, we're going to be speaking about this in the second half of the podcast. She's just been banned from standing as French president. Obviously, she is in pole position to replace Emmanuel Macron when the time comes. This is all about how she has used payments of staff in the past. From what you know of it, and I appreciate it may not be much, Robert Jenrick, what's your initial reaction to what's happened in the French courts this morning?
Well, I hesitate to comment because I don't know the strength or otherwise of the argument against her. And of course, if she is guilty of a crime, then it's quite right that she should be sentenced, and if under French law that precludes her from standing for office, then the law should be equal irrespective of your position. As we saw with Donald Trump, where there were some courts in the United States that tried to stop him from standing for office, the courts have to be very careful, I think, before being perceived to intervene in politics and to prevent candidates from standing for office, because that can be immensely corrosive to public trust and confidence in the political system. So I would just hope that the French courts are behaving in an entirely non-partisan way, but I don't know, in fairness, enough about the details of the case to comment more than that.
Robert Jenrick, thank you so much for joining us on the Daily Tea.
It's a pleasure as usual. Thank you.